How do dynamic routes work in Next.js? Well, it's pretty straightforward, and that's what we're going to cover here quickly today. So maybe you have an application where you have a list of users, or this could be even like a blog, a list of posts, or something like that. And maybe when you click on a user, you then want to show a more detailed page of that user. So I'm going to click on it here, and then you see we show like a more detailed profile of this user. And you can see in my URL here, instead of just being at users, we're at users/1. And the way that I'm doing this is I'm using dynamic routes in Next.js to where when I go to users/, this part is dynamic here. This number 1, this is the user ID. And then based on this user ID, I'm rendering a dynamic page. So I can also go to users/2 if I click on this user, and it's going to dynamically render this user profile. Same thing if I go to user 3, so on and so forth. So dynamic routes is something that you're probably going to be using in a lot of different applications. It is super useful to know about. So we're going to talk about the fundamentals of it here today. In future videos, we'll cover catch-all routes and some more kind of, I guess, complex things when it comes to routing, but we're just going to cover the dynamic routes here. So the way you set this up in Next.js is I have my users page here. This is at /users, and this is the page that you see right here. We just render out some different cards here. And basically all I do is I fetch users from this JSON placeholder API, and then I map over those users and render out a user card. A key thing I do here is that wrapping around my user card is I render a link component in which I set an href to be /users/ and then the user's ID. So when you click on these cards here, it's going to go to users / whatever the ID is of these users. So I think this Chelsea Dietrich user here has a user ID of 5. And then for Leanne, a user ID of 1. You can see it dynamically rendering the user ID here. So we have that, but how do we kind of implement that page that will dynamically render the user profile based on the user ID? Well, to create a dynamic route here in Next.js, you're going to use square brackets, and then you're going to, within those square brackets, create a name for whatever you want to kind of call the dynamic parameter. So in our case, since we're saying user ID here, we have square bracket ID square bracket. This could also be, square bracket user ID, square bracket. It's kind of saying, hey, we're expecting a dynamic ID here, or a dynamic user ID. Now, for the file structure here, it's going to be at users, and then within our users folder, it's where we put square bracket ID square bracket. So it's going to be users / whatever the ID is. And then within that folder, we create another page.jsx, as you can see here. Now, within this page, Next.js, for a dynamic route like this, we're automatically going to be passed this params object, in which there's going to be a property on this params object that is going to match the name of our dynamic folder here. So since this is square bracket ID square bracket, on this params object that I destructure here automatically in my page within my dynamic folder, on this params object, we can access the ID. If I changed this right here and I renamed it to something like user ID, then I would also need to change this in my params object to be user ID. It needs to match the name of my dynamic folder here. But I'm going to change it back here to ID because that's how I have everything set up. So I need to change this to ID as well. One important note here is that in Next.js 15, you now need to await this params object. So you can see I say const ID is equal to await params, because it is going to be asynchronous at this point in Next.js 15. So I await the ID, I destructure that from my params, and then what I do is I use that JSON placeholder API again, and I fetch the user with that given ID. So I call this fetch user function with an ID, and it fetches at this API with that dynamic ID. And I do that right here within my page. And then if there's a user, I render out this information about the user. So coming back here, I click on Patricia, and you can see it has a user ID of 4. So in my application here, this const ID equals await params. ID is going to resolve to be 4. And then I fetch the user with the ID of 4. And that's going to return the information to render out this right here. So it is fairly straightforward here. In my page component, I just render out my users. I set this link component to link to /users/ some dynamic value. So that's going to map to users/ this dynamic folder here that I create with the special square brackets. Square brackets is going to tell Next.js it's a dynamic route. We create this, so then when I link to it, it's going to pass the ID in the params object. We take that ID, make our network request with fetch user, and return this, which allows us to have this behavior of dynamically rendering a different user profile page based on whatever user ID is within our URL params here. So that's dynamic routes in Next.js. Fairly straightforward, but it can be a little bit tricky if you hadn't seen it. So hopefully this video helps and makes that clear. Future videos will cover some more kind of complexities around dynamic routes, but it's not too bad. So it'll also be fairly straightforward. So thanks for tuning into this. I'll see you in that next one.